a man sworn to uphold the law, a son eager to make his father proud, a woman caught between them in a web of passion, deceit, and betrayal. It should have been a story of love, of family, of legacy. Instead, it became a story of obsession, of secrets whispered in the dark, of a bond between father and son shattered beyond repair, and in the end it became a story of murder. If you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, child abuse, to mention a few, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you. Houston, Texas, a city where justice is meant to be served, where law and order are the backbone of society, and in the heart of it stood Sheriff Daniel Carter, respected, feared, a man who had spent decades carving out his reputation as an unshakable enforcer of the law. His word carried weight. His presence commanded authority. He was a husband, a father, a leader, and, behind closed doors, a man hiding the kind of secret that could destroy everything he had built. For years, Sheriff Carter upheld a code: loyalty, honor, integrity. He raised his son Ethan with those same values, grooming him to follow in his footsteps. Ethan admired his father, saw him as a role model, a figure of strength and wisdom. He had his whole life ahead of him, a promising career in law enforcement, a future filled with possibilities, and most importantly, a woman he loved by his side. Allison, his newly wedded wife, the woman he believed he would spend forever with. But forever never came, because someone else had his wife's heart, and that someone was his own father. It started with stolen glances, accidental touches, conversations that lingered just a little too long. No one noticed at first. No one suspected. But secrets have a way of unraveling, of creeping into the light no matter how deeply they're buried. Sheriff Carter and Allison thought they were careful. They thought no one would ever know. But passion is reckless, and forbidden desire is a fire that only burns hotter the longer it's fed. What began as a temptation turned into something neither of them could resist. A relationship that should have never existed. A betrayal that would turn deadly. But how did it begin? How did a respected sheriff, a man who had spent years upholding the law, cross the line into the ultimate betrayal? Did Allison truly love him? Or was she drawn in by the power he held, by the authority, by the forbidden thrill of it all? And what about Ethan? Did he see the signs? Did he feel the distance growing between himself and his wife? The way she pulled away? The way her touch no longer lingered the way it once did? Did he hear the whispers in the dead of night? The hushed phone calls, the excuses? Or was he completely blindsided when the truth finally came crashing down? Some secrets stay buried. Others explode in ways no one can predict. And in the case of Sheriff Carter, his son, and the woman caught between them, the truth didn't just destroy a marriage. It didn't just break a family. It left one of them dead. A single gunshot, a pool of blood, and a question that would haunt an entire community. Who pulled the trigger? And why? What really happened behind closed doors? How did a love triangle filled with passion and deception spiral into violence? And in the end, who paid the ultimate price? Once again, if you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, child abuse, to mention a few, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you. For years, Sheriff Carter built his life on discipline and control. He was the man people turned to when things went wrong, the voice of reason in a crisis. His badge wasn't just a job, it was his identity. But behind the uniform, behind the firm handshake and the unwavering gaze, there was a man with secrets, and the most dangerous secrets are the ones that feel impossible to resist. At the center of it all was his son, Ethan Carter, 26 years old, ambitious, determined, following in his father's footsteps. From the time he was a boy, he idolized the sheriff, wanted to be just like him, wanted to make him proud. It wasn't just about carrying on the Carter legacy, it was about earning his father's respect. And for most of his life, Ethan believed he had it, until he realized he and his father were competing for the same woman. Allison Carter, the newlywed bride, young, beautiful, full of life. She and Ethan had met in college. their love story playing out like something from a small-town fairy tale. She was charming, quick-witted, and effortlessly magnetic, the kind of woman who could command a room without even trying. To Ethan, she was everything, the missing piece of his future. And when they stood at the altar, exchanging vows in front of their family and friends, it seemed like the beginning of a lifetime of happiness. By all appearances, they had it all. The perfect couple, the perfect future, the kind of love that's meant to last forever. But forever wasn't in the cards, because behind the carefully curated image of a happy family was a truth too scandalous to be ignored. A truth that started as nothing more than stolen moments, lingering stares, words spoken just a little too softly. The kind of truth that, once discovered, could never be undone. Whispers turned into suspicions. Suspicions turned into late-night arguments. And late-night arguments turned into something much, much darker. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a betrayal. It was a story about what happens when love, power, and revenge collide in the most violent way imaginable. But how did it start? How did a sheriff, a man who built his career on discipline and order, become entangled in an affair that would ultimately destroy everything he had? How did a son who had spent his whole life looking up to his father come to realize the ultimate betrayal had been happening right under his nose? And how did Allison, a woman caught between two men, between passion and consequence, find herself at the center of a crime so shocking it would leave an entire city in disbelief? The truth is, no one ever saw it coming. Not at first. Not when the Carters stood together at Ethan and Allison's wedding, smiling for the cameras. Not when Sheriff Carter delivered a heartfelt speech, welcoming his new daughter-in-law to the family. Not even when the first rumors of something inappropriate began to surface. Because sometimes the most dangerous secrets hide in plain sight, and by the time the truth finally comes to light, it's already too late. Sheriff Daniel Carter had always been the kind of man who didn't waste time with small talk. He had a job to do. And in those early days when Ethan first introduced Allison to the family, the sheriff barely paid attention to the woman who would soon become his daughter-in-law. But she was captivating, quick-witted, confident, with a smile that could light up a room. And though his focus was on raising Ethan to follow in his footsteps, something about Allison caught his eye. She had the kind of energy that made you want to be around her, to listen to her laugh, to feel the warmth of her presence. It was innocent at first, but somewhere, in the quiet moments when no one was watching, something shifted. At first, it was the occasional conversation at family gatherings, just passing words, polite exchanges over dinner or during holidays, but it didn't take long before the sheriff found himself drawn to her in ways he had never expected. It wasn't just her looks, though she was undeniably beautiful. It was the way she made him feel seen, the way she could talk to him, not as a father-in-law, but as a man. The more he interacted with her, the more the lines between respect and something far darker began to blur, and all the while Ethan remained blissfully unaware. For Allison, the attraction was something she couldn't ignore. She had always been drawn to men with authority, with power. Growing up in a household where she learned to navigate her own place in the world, she admired the strength in men like Daniel Carter. But it wasn't just that. There was an undeniable spark between them, one that neither of them could extinguish. The glances became more frequent. The moments they shared lingered longer. Soon it was more than just innocent conversation. At first they justified it, told themselves it was just harmless. After all, Ethan was busy with his own work, his own ambitions. He had his life, and they had theirs. But the truth was, every stolen moment, every shared laugh, every quiet glance only served to fuel the fire that neither of them wanted to admit existed. It wasn't until one night, when Ethan was away on a work trip, that the affair finally crossed the line. The sheriff and Allison met at a local hotel under the guise of catching up. But what started as an innocent drink soon spiraled into something neither of them could walk away from. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and that night, the line between right and wrong blurred completely. They spent hours together in that hotel room, talking, drinking, and eventually giving in to the tension that had been building for months. The affair continued in secret, their rendezvous growing more frequent. They would steal moments when they could, Hotel rooms on the outskirts of town, late-night text messages, private phone calls when no one was listening. They kept their interactions hidden from everyone, but the weight of their secret grew heavier with each passing day. They thought no one knew, but the truth always finds a way to escape, no matter how hard we try to bury it. But Ethan wasn't blind. He was the last person to suspect his father and wife, but there were moments, a fleeting glance, a pause in a conversation that made him uneasy. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt off. One night, as Ethan sat in his hotel room on a business trip, his phone buzzed with a new message. It wasn't from Allison, it wasn't from his father, it was from an unknown number. The message read simply, "You're being watched." Ethan stared at the screen, his heart racing. He didn't know what to make of it. But that message was just the beginning, just the start of the unraveling. As Ethan dove deeper into the mystery, he would discover the unthinkable. His wife and father had betrayed him in ways he could never have imagined. What he found next would shatter everything. The next morning, Ethan confronted his father. The sheriff denied everything, of course he did. But the evidence, the messages, and the signs couldn't be ignored. The walls were closing in on both of them. And as Ethan stood there facing the man who had once been his hero, he couldn't help but wonder, how had he not seen it before? And how would he ever look his father in the eyes again? The message had been sent. The lies that Sheriff Daniel Carter had carefully crafted for years were starting to unravel. Ethan stood in the sterile silence of his hotel room, staring at the phone screen, his mind racing. "You're being watched." The cryptic message buzzed in his hand like a warning, and as the seconds ticked by, the weight of the revelation began to sink in. Someone knew. Someone had seen through the carefully constructed facade his father and wife had so expertly maintained, and that person was about to reveal everything. Ethan had always been the type of man who believed in facts, in truth. So, he didn't just sit idly by, stewing in his confusion. He began to investigate, quietly, methodically. He dug through phone records, combed through text messages, and listened to the vague whispers of his colleagues. It didn't take long before he had everything he needed. Every trace of a secret affair between his wife and father. The stolen moments, the late-night phone calls, the hotel meetups. Each piece of evidence was a knife to his heart, driving the betrayal deeper with each new discovery. His hands trembled as he reviewed the texts on his phone, reading the loving exchanges between his wife and father, the sweet words, the passionate declarations, the images sent under the cover of night. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. This wasn't just a betrayal of love, it was a betrayal of everything he had ever known. The man who had raised him, who had taught him right from wrong, was the same man who had destroyed his world. He had to confront them. He had to confront his father. But how? What would he even say? He had so many questions, so many emotions swirling inside of him. Anger, confusion, a deep sense of loss that he couldn't shake. And yet somehow, there was this undercurrent of fear. Fear that in confronting them he would not only lose his father and wife forever, but that he would never truly understand how they could do this to him. Ethan didn't waste any time. He drove straight to the family home. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest, the streets outside a blur. He could barely breathe, but one thing kept him moving forward: the need to face the truth. The front door slammed open, the sound echoing through the quiet house. The tension was palpable as Ethan stepped inside. He didn't waste any words. He went straight for the heart of the matter. "You and Allison. How long?" he demanded, his voice raw, shaking with emotion. For a moment, Sheriff Carter said nothing. He stood there, his face unreadable, a man caught between the life he had built and the wreckage of the lies he had told. Allison, standing just a few steps away, looked like a deer caught in headlights. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it just as quickly, as though the words had vanished. There was nothing left to say, nothing that could repair the damage done. Ethan's voice grew louder. "How long, Dad? How long have you been doing this, behind my back, behind my life?" His words were harsh, but they were nothing compared to the pain in his eyes, the pain that had been building ever since that first message came through. Sheriff Carter took a step forward as though preparing to defend himself, but there was a hesitation in his movements. He seemed to be calculating his next words, trying to choose the right moment to speak, but it was clear he didn't have an answer that could make any of this right. And then, the explosion came. It was more than a heated argument. It was a storm of raw emotion, rage, and betrayal. Ethan lunged forward, his fists clenched in fury, his body trembling with the weight of everything he had just learned. "You betrayed me. You betrayed this family. Do you even care?" His voice cracked, the words more of a scream than a question. The sheriff raised his hands in a defensive gesture, but the damage was already done. Words were exchanged. Angry, bitter words that cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. It wasn't just an argument anymore, it was a confrontation that neither side could walk away from. Allison stepped between them, her voice desperate, pleading, "Please stop, this isn't the way." But it was too late. The fury had consumed them both. Ethan's anger flared, a torrent that he could no longer control. And just as he pushed past his father, ready to leave, ready to escape the suffocating weight of this betrayal, something happened, something that would change everything. The sound was deafening, a single shot, a sharp crack that echoed through the house, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Ethan froze, his body rigid, the air thick with shock. It wasn't until he felt the warmth spreading across his chest that he realized what had happened. The blood, the burning pain. He looked down, his eyes widening in disbelief, and then everything went black. Sheriff Daniel Carter stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide in shock, his hands trembling. He had no idea what had just happened, but one thing was clear. The confrontation had escalated beyond anything he had ever intended. Allison, standing by the front door, was equally paralyzed by the sound of the shot. She had heard it, felt it reverberate through the house, and in that instant, her world shifted. She rushed toward Ethan, her hands shaking as she knelt beside him, pressing against the growing pool of blood, trying hopelessly to stop the flow. But it was too late. The sheriff's son, her husband, was dead. The paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. The house was flooded with sirens, flashing lights, and the rush of uniformed officers. Their faces were tense, trained to handle any situation. But even they seemed unsettled by what they were walking into. A high-ranking sheriff's son lying in a pool of blood. A mother and wife who were just moments ago caught in an argument so violent it could have been straight out of a nightmare, stood there, staring at the scene in disbelief. No one moved at first, unsure of who was responsible, unsure of what exactly had happened. The sheriff stood at the door, watching as his son was tended to by the medical team, his mind racing. His once pristine image, built over years of service, was shattered in an instant. He had never imagined this moment would come. He had been so careful, so deliberate in keeping his double life hidden. But now it was all out in the open. His own son, his own flesh and blood, lay lifeless on the floor of their family home. Detective Laura Jenkins, the lead investigator on the case, stepped through the door, her gaze immediately locking onto the scene in front of her. She immediately took control, instructing officers to cordon off the house and secure the area. The first thing they did was gather all the people present at the scene, Allison and Sheriff Carter, of course, but also the neighbors who had heard the shouting moments before the shot rang out. No one knew what had happened exactly, but all of them seemed to be in a state of shock. The blood splatter was undeniable. Detective Jenkins examined the trajectory of the blood carefully, noting where it had splashed against the walls, the angle at which it sprayed across the hardwood floor. The pattern suggested that the shot had been fired from a relatively short distance, with no signs of an accidental discharge. This wasn't a case of a gun just going off. It was deliberate, but who had pulled the trigger? Allison, the only other person in the house, insisted she hadn't seen anything. She was in the hallway when the shot rang out, she said. She had heard the argument between her husband and father-in-law, but she never imagined it would escalate to violence. She claimed she had been in the process of walking toward the door to leave when the shot rang out. She hadn't even been in the room with them when it happened. Detective Jenkins knew that understanding the motivations behind the shooting would be just as important as understanding who had fired the shot. Sheriff Carter was the first person to be questioned. His eyes were red, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. We argued. Ethan was angry. He came at me. He wanted answers. But Jenkins wasn't convinced. The timeline didn't add up. According to the neighbors, the confrontation had been heated, yes, but it hadn't been physical, not to the point of violence. They heard yelling, but there were no screams, no signs of a struggle. The gunshot came too quickly after the argument began, and the positioning of the body suggested it wasn't a random accident. Next, Allison was questioned. She repeated her version of events. She had heard the argument, but she had been in the hallway too far away to intervene. She had heard the gunshot, but by the time she ran into the room, Ethan was already on the floor. The sheriff had been holding the gun. But that's all she knew. The more they examined her, the more Jenkins started to see inconsistencies. The blood on Allison's hands wasn't just from trying to help Ethan, it was from somewhere else. Somewhere she couldn't explain. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the forensic team confirmed it. Traces of gunpowder residue had been found on Allison's clothing. It was a small detail, but it was telling. The deeper they dug, the more questions they uncovered. The sheriff had been the one to call 911, his voice cracking as he told the dispatcher, "My son's been shot. He's dead. I don't know what happened." His words were full of fear, full of panic. But they were also full of holes. Sheriff Carter had claimed self-defense. He said his son had attacked him in a fit of rage, and the gun had gone off accidentally in the heat of the struggle. The sheriff's story was consistent, almost too consistent. He had been the one to call 911, his voice cracking as he explained what happened. But something about his explanation didn't sit right with Detective Jenkins. Was it really self-defense, or was the sheriff simply trying to cover his tracks? But if the sheriff didn't kill his son in self-defense, then what was his motive? Detective Jenkins couldn't shake the thought. Was this a crime of passion? Had Ethan discovered the affair and confronted his father about it in a fit of rage? Was the sheriff simply protecting himself from a violent confrontation? Allison had been adamant in her initial statements that she had not been involved in the shooting. She claimed to have been in the hallway when it happened, too far from the room to know exactly what had gone down. But there was something in her body language during her interrogation that didn't quite match her words. Jenkins sat across from her, watching carefully. Allison's eyes darted nervously, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she recounted the events. She claimed she had rushed in to help after the shot rang out, but Jenkins noticed that every time she spoke about the events, her body shifted slightly, betraying a subconscious effort to distance herself from the situation. Was it guilt? Was it manipulation? As Allison's body language was scrutinized, a disturbing theory started to take shape. Had she been manipulating both men? Could she have played them against each other, using the sheriff's authority to get close to him while secretly growing closer to his son? Perhaps she had used the affair to fuel a conflict between them, knowing that a violent confrontation could end in her favor. Jenkins couldn't ignore the possibility that Allison was more involved than she was letting on. She had known exactly how to push both men's buttons, how to twist their emotions to fit her needs. She had been the catalyst for this tragedy, the silent hand that had played both father and son against each other. But then there was the son, Ethan. Could he have planned revenge? Had he discovered the affair earlier than anyone realized? What if Ethan had learned the truth and confronted his father, not in a moment of rage, but with calculated intent? It was clear from the text messages and phone records that he had discovered the affair. But was there more to his anger than just betrayal? Had he plotted his revenge, knowing that his father would be the one to snap first? The more the detectives investigated, the more questions they had. The sheriff's story of self-defense no longer seemed plausible, and Allison's involvement grew murkier with each passing day. But still, the one piece that remained elusive was the trigger. Who had actually pulled it? It wasn't until Detective Jenkins reviewed the 911 call again that something stood out. The sheriff's voice, full of panic, was unmistakable, but there was something buried deep in his words, an inconsistency, an admission he hadn't meant to make. "My son's been shot. I didn't mean to," he stammered. But the pause that followed was telling. It was almost as if he was still deciding how to present the situation, weighing whether to claim it was an accident or a tragic misunderstanding. As the investigation continued, The theory of a murder motivated by self-preservation started to gain traction. The sheriff may have known that his affair was about to be exposed, and in that moment of confrontation with his son, he made the ultimate decision to protect his reputation, no matter the cost. But even as new evidence came to light, the case was far from clear-cut. Allison had her own secrets, and her relationship with both men was far more complicated than it appeared on the surface. The truth was slipping through the cracks, and with every new piece of evidence, the web of lies seemed to grow even more tangled. The case had reached its final chapter. The courtroom was packed. Family members of the victim sat in silence, their faces drawn with grief and confusion. Lawyers for both sides paced nervously, preparing to present their arguments to a jury that was about to decide the fate of a sheriff, a son, and a wife, each bound by the same tragedy, but each with their own story to tell. The jury delivered its verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. It was a sentence that stunned the community, a community that had once revered him. The sheriff's once promising future behind bars now seemed inevitable. But what would become of the others involved in this tragedy? Allison, caught in the web of this devastating love triangle, faced her own set of consequences. While she wasn't charged with the murder itself, the court found her guilty of complicity in the affair, and she was sentenced to serve time in prison for obstruction of justice and lying under oath. The woman who had once been torn between two men now faced the brutal reality of the world she had created. As for the community, their reaction was mixed. Many had supported Sheriff Carter throughout his career, but once the truth came to light, a sense of betrayal settled over the town. Neighbors, co-workers, and friends who had once praised the sheriff were now left questioning everything they thought they knew about him. His arrest was met with disbelief, as the image of the trusted sheriff was replaced by that of a cold-blooded killer. People asked, how could this happen? The once thriving family was now torn apart, the legacy of their community shattered by lies, secrets, and betrayal. The wife of the sheriff's son, who had now lost both men, faced the public eye, condemned and pitied in equal measure. She became a symbol of everything wrong with the affair, the woman who had ultimately played a part in the tragic downfall of a once proud family. What was left, in the end? Was there ever a winner in this twisted game of betrayal? Perhaps the most tragic thing of all was that no one truly walked away unscathed. The sheriff, imprisoned and disgraced, would have to live with the weight of his actions for the rest of his life. Allison, once a woman filled with promise, found herself locked away, her future stolen by choices that could never be undone. And the son, Ethan, the innocent victim, would never get the chance to live the life he deserved. Lust, power, betrayal, this case had it all. But in the end, no one really won. There was no victor in this tragedy, only loss. A son lost to a father's rage, a father lost to the law, and a woman lost in a web of her own making. The community that once held this family in high regard was left in the dust, grappling with the fallout of a crime that no one could have predicted but everyone had seen coming. This case serves as a reminder that beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives, there can be dark secrets. Secrets that, once exposed, can unravel everything. A respected sheriff, a newlywed wife, a son in search of answers, each with their own flaws, their own desires, their own pain. In the end, they all paid the price. But the real question now is for you, the viewer. What do you think? Was this crime inevitable, or could it have been prevented? Was justice served, or was there more to this story than we'll ever know? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your theories, and your reflections on a case that will haunt this family and this community for generations to come. If you want to see more real crime stories, unsolved cases, and deep dives into the world of justice, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell icon for updates on future content. Your support means the world to us as we continue to bring these powerful stories to light.